Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. And we'll start first by making sure that our phones are silenced so that we can really enjoy our event for this evening. Can everyone hear well? Everyone, it's fairly audible? Excellent. So we're going to go ahead and start off with a land acknowledgement. We'll have a brief opening prayer, and then I'll introduce our speaker for this evening. So beginning with our land and water acknowledgement, Oblate School of Theology acknowledges the area we now call San Antonio as the ancestral lands of the numerous affiliated indigenous groups, bands, and clans now collectively referred to as the Coahuiltecan and Tonkawa peoples. We further acknowledge the San Antonio River as Yanaguana, or spirit waters, in Payaya, a language of the Tapilam Coahuiltecan nation. We honor their enduring presence in and connection to this land, which includes Yanaguana and the surrounding environment. I also want to take an opportunity, those of you who have been on our campus who may not have been here before, I want to acknowledge the Oblate Cemetery that we have on campus. There are 377 souls interred at the Oblate Cemetery with whom we share this campus. Their presence on these grounds demonstrates the commitment and connection of the missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate to the communities of the faithful in Central and Southwest Texas. So before we begin this evening's lecture, I invite you to join me in prayer as we seek God's guidance and illumination in our time together. Heavenly Creator, source of wisdom and inspiration, we gather today to honor the life and legacy of J.R.R. Tolkien, a storyteller who wove light and truth into his tales. May his love for language, myth, and the deep struggles of the human spirit inspire us in our own learning and creativity. Bless this lecture that we may gain insight, wisdom, and a renewed sense of wonder. May our words and thoughts, like his, be guided by truth, courage, and imagination. Amen. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. I knew him first through his work, Tolkien Dogmatics, but I think that I am not going too far to call him now a friend. Austin Freeman earned his PhD in systematic theology at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and he is the author of Tolkien Dogmatics, Theology Through Mythology with the Maker of Middle-earth. He's also an editor and contributor to Tolkien Among the Theologians, Theology and H.P. Lovecraft, and Theology, Fantasy, and the Imagination. His essays on Tolkien appear in books such as Tolkien and the Classical World and The Romantic Spirit in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, cover wide-ranging aspects of Tolkien's theological outlook. He's a noted speaker on Tolkien's theology, and he's the chair of apologetics at Houston Christian University. He did us the great kindness and honor of driving down yesterday, and he's going to drive back tomorrow. So please give him a very warm San Antonio welcome, Dr. Austin Freeman. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I do want to say, yes, Antonio and I are friends. And I have felt very warmly welcomed already in this community. And thank you so much for all of your hospitality. I hope that the title of my talk did its job of being intriguing, but also giving you a good idea of what I actually would be talking about. If you're like many folks, you ask the question, why in the world would we consider Tolkien to be an apologist? The connection to imagination is clear. The connection to apologetics may be not as clear. Tolkien is not considered to be an apologist of any sort. I mean, heck, I've had a hard enough time convincing most people that he was even a Christian. It was C.S. Lewis who was the apologist of the Inklings, of course. Tolkien was famously a mumbler. What does he have to say? Well, I could mention the fact that he was a member, even an officer, in several debating societies throughout his life, that multiple times a week he sought out and got into good-natured arguments about topics, often theological topics, with his friends. That as a full endowed professor at the world's leading university, he probably did know at least a few things about constructing a tight argument and responding to objections. I mean, let's talk about how he destroyed previous consensus about Beowulf, for instance. Could he hold a minority theological position with courage and humility? Yes, he could. He was a Roman Catholic in 20th century Oxford. But look, all of that's prefatory matter. What I want to deal with tonight is not Tolkien as the apologist simpliciter. I want to talk about Tolkien as apologist to the imagination. So, in tonight's talk, I have 4 movements. First, I'm going to discuss how Tolkien did, in fact, have a general apologetic methodology. Second, I want to get some conceptual clarity on that final word in tonight's title, which is imagination. Third, I will move into Tolkien's apologetic argument from imagination. And then finally, I want to spend a bit of time on a case study that shows how Tolkien used imaginative apologetics in a specific instance. So, to our first point. Does Tolkien ever deal in apologetics proper? Does Tolkien give arguments for God or defenses of Christianity per se? And perhaps surprisingly to some, the answer is yes. Tolkien does engage with the questions of God's existence, but he never really seems in doubt to the answer to that question. The reality of God does not seem to have troubled Tolkien at any point in his life, as it did for the young C.S. Lewis or G.K. Chesterton, each of whom had several years of atheism. I don't buy Tolkien scholar Verlin Flieger's argument that Tolkien had these long dark nights of the soul. He had no period of spiritual waywardness, unless we perhaps count his first year of university. He mentions a period in one of his letters where he admits that he was less observant of his religion. But as I say in my book, if we're talking about a man who attended mass sometimes daily, even when it was possible, traveling to a different company on the battlefield to attend during his deployment in France in the Great War, it's kind of hard to say what less observant means to somebody like that, right? So I think Holly Ordway, my colleague at HCU, I think her most recent book does a very admirable job of showing that the tragedies of Tolkien's earlier life that could very well have turned him away from the faith actually seemed to confirm him in that faith. And he seems to be basically happy with the standard apologetic arguments of his day. So, for example, to a young girl who's writing to him about the meaning of life, he employs this argument from design. If we go up the scale of being to other living things, such as, say, some small plant, it presents shape and organization, a pattern recognizable with variation in its kin and offspring. And that is deeply interesting because these things are other and we did not make them. And they seem to proceed from a fountain of invention incalculably richer than our own. Human curiosity soon asks the question, how? In what way did this come to be? And since the recognizable pattern suggests design, may proceed to why. But why, in this sense, implying reasons and motives, can only refer to a mind. Only a mind can have purposes in any way or degree akin to human purposes. So at once, any question, why did life, the community of living things, appear in the physical universe, introduces the question, is there a God, a creator designer, a mind of which our minds are akin, being derived from it, so that it is intelligible to us in part? And with that, we come to religion and the moral ideas that proceed from it. If you do not believe in a personal God, the question, what is the purpose of life, is unaskable and unanswerable. To whom or what would you address the question? In On Fairy Stories, he tries to combat the mythicist view that was very popular in comparative religion at the time, coming out of early anthropologists like J.G. Fraser, Golden Bough, E.B. Tyler, other people, that all religion stems not from truth, but from nature worship or ritual or some other source. And at one time, he says, it was a dominant view that all such matter was derived from nature myths. The Olympians were personifications of the sun, of dawn, of night, and so on. And all the stories told about them were originally myths, allegories would have been a better word, of the greater elemental changes and processes of nature. Epic, heroic legend, saga, then localized these stories in real places and humanized them by attributing to them ancestral heroes, mightier than men, and yet already men. This is the stance that he's combating. He says, that would seem to be the truth almost upside down. Let us assume for the moment, as this theory assumes, that nothing actually exists corresponding to the gods of mythology, no personalities, only astronomical or meteorological objects, then these natural objects can only be arrayed with a personal significance and glory by a gift, the gift of a person, of a man. Personality can only be derived from a person. The gods may derive their color and beauty from the high splendors of nature, but it was man who obtained these for them, abstracted them from sun and moon and cloud. Their personality they get direct from him. The shadow or flicker of divinity that is upon them, they receive through him from the invisible world, the supernatural. And notice the capital S there. So here he's basically saying that observation, abstraction, synthesis, these are activities of a conscious mind. So Thor, for instance, who is this sort of red-bearded, rambunctious farmer, is not necessarily Chris Hemsworth, is only interesting insofar as he is a person, not insofar as he is thunder. It's the combination of the personality with awe that creates worship. And now, like personally, I'm not so sure that this argument works, but he does use it against a common claim in his day, and it's one that actually is still around in the Jesus myth theory. And entertainingly, they are still citing the same debunked Victorian sources like J.G. Frazer. So regardless, Tolkien is, at minimum, engaged with the idea of apologetics, not least in that it irritated him that a layman like C.S. Lewis was becoming a public theologian and apologist and sort of usurping the professional's prerogatives. So my title is not just Tolkien as apologist, it's Tolkien as apologist to the imagination. Now we need to get some clarity on that admittedly rather contested term. I won't spend a ton of time here. We can grab a few prominent figures roughly at random. We can see a movement towards the prioritization of imagination in human life, which culminates in the movement known as Romanticism. So we'll begin in the classical tradition. For Aristotle, it's called fantasia or imagination because it's the thing by virtue of which we form images in our mind. A few notes. Aristotle says that imagination is mostly false. We think of things that aren't there by definition. The imagination, however, relies on sense data, at least for its initial building blocks, and only creatures with sense impressions imagine things. So theoretically, for Aristotle, it is possible for your dog to have an imagination. I think mine does. But Aristotle doesn't really deal with the moral elements of the imagination at all. He does not evaluate it as good or bad. He does not dwell on how it can become more meaningful, other than just picturing things that aren't there. That's kind of where he leaves it. Now, in the medieval era, Thomas Aquinas, for example, agrees with Aristotle by and large. Then he reduces Ibn Sina's theory of another power between these two faculties of sense and imagination. And this is the passage he thinks that there's something which combines and divides imaginary forms, as when from the imaginary form of gold, the imaginary form of a mountain, we compose the one form of a golden mountain, which we have never seen. And he says that this latter faculty, the ability to say a golden mountain, is a uniquely human activity. So now the imagination at this point in history is able to construct unreal objects in the mind, things that not just which don't exist, but which never could exist, at least in the real world. In the Romantic period, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's definition, it does remain highly influential, maybe a bit mysterious, but it's the one that Tolkien picks up on and works with directly. This is a very contested passage. Basically, he says we've got the primary imagination and the secondary imagination. So I'm going to suggest primary imagination is intuition, secondary imagination is analysis. And then he spins off from that this faculty that he calls fancy or fantasy, which is that basic image-making ability that Aquinas and Aristotle are talking about. And this is the definition that's going to exercise Tolkien. Coleridge, by this point, he's into Romanticism. He is now elevating that unifying imaginative faculty, but notice that he is derogating fantasy. That's the least important one. Okay, this is where Tolkien takes issue. Interestingly, Tolkien, in On Fairy Stories, he flips Coleridge's definitions, goes back to the classical and medieval definition of the imagination as forming mental images of things that aren't there. And he says fancy is, or fantasy is the deeper sense. It begins in imagination, it proceeds beyond it. He says that when our imaginative impressions are made to cohere, to unify, we are now doing what he calls sub-creating. We are artists of the mind. What we are able to produce is things which to some degree feel real, but they don't exist in the primary world at all. And that's when he says, fantasy is, I think, not a lower, but a higher form of art. Indeed, the most nearly pure form, and so when achieved, the most potent. Tolkien admits, though, in like common everyday language, what he calls fantasy is termed imagination. This is the ability to make a new world, to conceive of new possibilities, to enter into what the historian Michael Saylor calls the as-if. And this is connected to what C.S. Lewis means when he writes, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. Imagination is the faculty by which we can mentally impose order and significance onto our impression of the world. It is the principle of unity that holds together all of our discrete sensations. What do I mean? Well, I can see a wall, a roof, a window. Rather than just three disconnected bits of data, I conceive of a lecture hall. I could cover my hand, or cover my face with my hand. You can imagine, you can picture my face behind there. Fantasy, however, we can picture a whole world. We can picture new entities within that world. And then we can fit them into this seamless garment of plausibility structures, things which have never existed, but which we then call into mental existence in this lesser derived form of God's creative act. And usually, fantasy literature, not only are we focusing on just creating new forms, but beautiful forms, artistic forms, things that incite desire, love in their audience. That's why Tolkien calls it art. So I want to shift here slightly from what we mean when we talk about imagination or fantasy to the result of exercising those faculties. So what role does imagination play in apologetics? Can literature, the arts, play a role in arguing for the truth of Christianity? And if so, how? A brief example is going to help here, and it's going to help to show that this is biblical too. This is 2 Samuel chapter 12. Many of you know this story. David has just finished committing adultery with Bathsheba, sending her rightful husband Uriah the Hittite off to be murdered. And so the prophet Nathan comes to David from God to confront him about this sin. And this is where we start chapter 12. The Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children, and it used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. And then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. And Nathan said to David, you are the man. And David repents of his sin. That is imaginative apologetics right there. It is a story that Nathan tells in order to have David's heart resonate with the truth that would otherwise be rejected. Nathan is using the faculty of imagination to create a connection, to note a structural similarity between the lamb situation and David's situation. Now, he could just directly say, you're a bad person for doing this. He doesn't. He could even have said, your behavior as if a rich man took a poor man's lamb. But he doesn't even do that. He paints this whole picture of the situation about the lamb eating and resting in his bosom, all that stuff. That's extraneous detail. And he does that before he brings down the hammer. Because, of course, it's not extraneous detail at all for the purposes that Nathan is using. So we see what we could refer to here as indirect discourse, Kierkegaard, or what C.S. Lewis might call sneaking past watchful dragons. Psychologically, it seems obvious that people's walls go up when you confront them with the need to admit their wrongdoing, for example, to make a deep change in their life and their perspective on the world, repent and believe the gospel. You cannot always make that direct assault because those walls are very strong, and you have to get around those walls somehow in order to touch the heart. So there are a few concepts that in technical parlance we call the transcendentals. Some of the three that are most recognized here are truth, goodness, and beauty. And those transcendentals, they are all ultimately unified. They are one in God, but we can distinguish them conceptually. And when we encounter each of these, there is an appropriate response to them. So you respond to truth with belief. You respond to goodness with admiration or imitation. And there are other forms of apologetics that touch on these. Your standard apologetics, classical evidentialist approaches, they operate through truth. And then there's your witness, your character that backs up what you say and that validates your claim, that operates through goodness. But there's that third transcendental over there. There's beauty. How do you respond to beauty? You respond to beauty with desire. But we don't just immediately love the things that reason presents to us. That is not how human psychology actually works. Look at Twitter, okay? It's very importantly, there is this Augustinian notion that the reasoning process follows the heart and not the other way around. We rationalize frequently what we love. And that is just how conspiracy theories work too, by the way. We just continue to rationalize because we're holding on to something in our hearts, because the fundamental problem of sin is disordered desire. Our loves are out of place. And so our minds, which are also corrupted, they follow this disordered desire. Is everybody tracking with me? Okay. That's why theologian Paul Gould says imaginative apologetics, or what he calls cultural apologetics, must demonstrate not only the truth of Christianity, but also its desirability. While men's desire for truth, goodness, and beauty has become distorted, the desire remains. Part of our job as cultural apologists is to help reawaken these universal and natural human desires and redirect them towards their proper end. So here's where we tie back in to imagination, because as we said, our fundamental problem in sin is disordered desire. It's not loving the things that we ought to love. And we said that beauty creates desire. It creates love. The imagination is a way of directing a certain sort of seeing. The artistic imagination in particular is a vehicle for producing forms of beauty. Imagination creates beauty. Beauty creates love. Love opens itself to truth. And so for imaginative apologetics, art and literature then are going to serve as a prime vehicle for doing this, because it is through stories that these things resonate with us most forcefully. And these stories resonate because we are narrative beings at our core. We are hardwired to respond to these things. That is the way that God made us. So now, when you have a Christian imagination, which has been conditioned by truth and goodness, then you begin to be able to rehabilitate the desires of your listeners through this captivation by beauty. And sometimes the goal, which by the way is the love of God, is explicit in the piece of art, and sometimes it's not. And that depends on a lot of factors. But the end question is, how effective is it at instilling a desire for this sort of world, for this sort of truth and goodness through the beauty that it manifests? How well does a particular piece of literature or art create the right sorts of desires within its readers? Now, in apologetics, though, this is only the first step, because the intellect obviously has something to do with this here as well. This is a 1-2 punch. You find the thing that is captivating the desires of the heart. You're finding your audience wishing that such a world were true. And then I can come along and I can explain, I can reason out how, in fact, it is true and it is available for you to enter into. So, as I mentioned, my colleague, Holly Ordway, will say, over and above this, that imaginative apologetics offers a second advantage, which is to illustrate a concept in an impactful way. So in the same way that Nathan's story about the lamb illustrates injustice, Holly Ordway writes, it is this lack of meaning rather than disagreement what Christian doctrine properly understood that often presents the most significant barrier to any serious consideration of the faith. So she continues, imaginative apologetics seeks to harness the God-given faculty of imagination to work in cooperation with reason, to open a way for the work of the Holy Spirit, and to guide the will towards a commitment to Christ. So in short then, imaginative apologetics seeks to show what a theological concept actually means, what its content might be, through the method of illustrating the concept as it functions. I was actually already speaking to somebody today that says this is how she leads her catechesis class. She uses these sorts of examples. And attached to that practice, it carries along also a pleasure or a love that we experience towards that concept as we see it functioning in something that feels like reality. We desire it to be true. So in that sense, I don't know that there are very many other works of art that quite invoke the proper sort of desire other than The Lord of the Rings, right? Tolkien portrays a world that, yes, it feels real, but it also feels like something we would wish to dwell in. His heroes are actually virtuous. They're not just cardboard cutouts. He maintains the moral complexity of our own world in villains like Gollum and Boromir. His villains are complex. Their evil desires, they're not just ciphers. They show us how our own desires could go wrong. I mean, even Gollum receives pity that he doesn't deserve. Tolkien shows the beauty of sacrifice. He encourages the weak to persevere against the evil and powerful. He inspires wonder in the natural world. We want to live in the Shire. We want to be citizens of Gondor under Aragorn. And why is that the case? It's because Tolkien has united truth and goodness with beauty. He has built a world that is soaked in that light from an invisible lamp that he mentions in his letters. He has built a world that operates under Christian principles, Christian metaphysics, Christian anthropology, Christian ethics. And then imaginatively, he drives these points home to us by couching them in unfamiliar forms. The way he speaks about it in On Fairy Stories. He's able to use this method of fantasy to bypass the psychological guardrails that we've placed upon our hearts. And it's not that Tolkien has written a Christian story or a gospel presentation or an allegory in disguise. It's that Tolkien understands that this is how good art functions intrinsically. So he is awake at the wheel, as it were. He is able to harness and to channel the full power of God's inbuilt imaginative witness to his culture. He knows what he's doing. So this leads us into where I want to stay for the rest of the lecture. And that's in what I'll call Tolkien's argument from imagination. And he pursues this argument in two parallel places, in his poem to C.S. Lewis, Mythopoeia, and then in his much later essay on fairy stories. He wrote Mythopoeia to Lewis when Lewis was not yet a Christian. Lewis had called myths lies breathed through silver, which is to say, they were beautiful, but they were not true. And Tolkien responded by arguing that myth carries a particularly powerful sort of meaning, one which is actually more true to the nature of the human person and to our experience of the cosmos than what Lewis took to be reality, which was just materialism. So Tolkien begins his poem by describing the materialist vision of the universe. The earth, the sun, they're nothing special, really. Human history just sort of unrolls automatically in this purposeless, irresistible march. But then he rebuts this vision by starting with the fact that our knowledge of the world begins with sense impressions. And already we're reminded of those classical definitions of imagination. Trees, he said, are not constituted as discrete particular objects until a conscious mind sees them, unifies them as such, right? If the reality of the universe is just these assemblages of atoms, then what difference does it really make when the rough concentration of carbon atoms gives way to a heavier concentration of oxygen and nitrogen atoms? But that's not our experience, is it? An impressionist canvas, on one account, is just a plane of variously colored dots. And that would be all it is, in one sense. But our minds receive those dots, and the imagination unifies them into a representation of water lilies, for instance. So it's the experience of consciousness, particularly the ability of the imaginative faculty to construe, to connect our sense impressions, which opens up then a very different world than the particle field of varying density story, okay? And conscious minds, he says, are not just rational, They are holistic entities that include emotion, linguistic connotations, all sorts of extra bits in their interpretation of these sensations. So then inevitably, the human experience of the world does not begin in mechanism, it begins in meaning. That's what Tolkien means when he writes, "He sees no stars, who does not see them first, of living silver made, that sudden burst to flame like flowers beneath an ancient song, whose very echo after music long has since pursued. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tent, myth-woven and elf-patterned, and no earth, unless the mother's womb, whence all have birth." The mythic images are closer to the root of our consciousness of the world than these other sorts of descriptions, because they don't break off one piece of the human person and then exalt that to this artificial supremacy. They keep every element of our experience unified. That includes the levels of meaning and affective response. And this is where Tolkien makes the theological turn. He implicitly argues that this situation is not just this haphazard evolutionary throw up. It is the reflection of a creator. It is this artistic impulse that takes priority in our interpretation of the world because we are made in the image of a maker. And this is the heart of the poem. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned, his world dominion by creative act. Not his to worship the great artifact, man, subcreator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and sowed the seeds of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. The right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we are made. Have anybody read this poem before? Isn't it like the greatest thing ever? Okay, so now he's going to rebut the accusation that fantasy or the imaginative construal of the world is a denial of reality, that it's escapism. Let's say that's true, he says. But where did the desire for a different sort of world come from? That ability to judge between beauty and ugliness. Not every wish is baseless, right? We wish for love and food and freedom and all sorts of things that really exist. And besides, if we just reduce everything to evolution, we then actually lose the ability to resist evil because evil dissolves into this mechanism, right? A tiger would not be evil for killing that ewe lamb, but the rich man was. If everything is reduced to this deterministic chemical reactions in our brain, then we're no longer morally responsible. And therefore, both evil and good are illusions. By contrast, Tolkien begins listing his own beatitudes. He's blessing those who refuse to bow to evil despite its overwhelming power, who, like Noah in this ark of art, they are sailing forward towards a harbor that they cannot see. It's the legend makers who retain the sense of danger and wonder and who are still able to inspire us towards these better things. If it is a choice, he says, between seeing humans as progressive apes marching down the same old track or as the foolish artists, choose the artists. I would with the beleaguered fools be told that keep an inner fastness with their gold, and pure and scanty, yet they loyally bring to mint an image blurred of distant king, or in fantastic banners weave the sheen heraldic emblems of a lord unseen. The artists, the Christian artists, are in their own limited, imperfect way, the ones who are preserving the knowledge of God. They're shoring up their fragments against our ruin. And one day in heaven, after all of the disharmonies of evil have been quieted, if it all is as it should be, we might then look around and we see that salvation hasn't disposed of all of our silly stories. It has fulfilled them. And maybe our stories will come true and we'll go on making because that's what we're made for. But we'll do it perfectly, without sin, and in conscious knowledge, in celebration of God's infinite variety. That's a pretty good vision. So to summarize Mythopoeia, Tolkien is arguing that the faculty of imagination, perhaps the artistic vision more broadly, is actually a truer way of knowing our world than the scientistic one. And he makes two claims to try to explain human experience in this way. First, that art is a basic function of human nature. Second, that it is because we are designed in the image of an artist. Many years later, in On Fairy Stories, Tolkien supplements this argument that he outlines these three moves that fantasy helps us to make. He calls them escape, recovery, and consolation. We must escape from the dullness or the possessiveness with which we view the world, which we ought to view with wonder and delight and pleasure. We're not escaping from responsibility. We are escaping from the prison cell of a harmful worldview and into then another imagined world that can help us to recover a proper perspective on the actual world. And Tolkien calls this restoring our health. He calls it regaining a clear view. He calls it cleaning our windows, seeing things as we're meant to see them. So the marvel of the centaur, it reestablishes the marvel of the horse. Meeting a wolf in a fairy tale helps us to be struck again with that danger, that primal otherness of the real wolf. And he's stealing all of this from Chesterton, but it's still good. But when we make a proper recovery, then we also realize that there are some things wrong with the real world that aren't so easy to get rid of. Things like death, for instance. So there comes this deeper impulse for escape, or perhaps more properly than for transcendence. This world, which is enchanted as it is now that all the grime has been wiped away and we see it sparkling and fresh again, it's still not right. It's not the way it's supposed to be. We also need then what Tolkien calls the central essential element of all fairy tales, the consolation of the happy ending. We need to know that somewhere we can get to the place where things are right. And this is the point at which Tolkien introduces his famous term eucatastrophe, the sudden unexpected turn where at the darkest moment, everything comes into place, disaster is averted, the eagles are coming, the horns of Rohan sound in the morning. Eucatastrophe in Greek just means the good catastrophe. It is the denial that evil will have the last word. And Tolkien says it produces a certain sort of exultant joy. He says this sort of joy produces its peculiar effect because it is a sudden glimpse of truth. Your whole nature, chained in material cause and effect, the chain of death, feels a sudden relief as if a major limb out of joint had suddenly snapped back. It perceives that this is indeed how things really do work in the great world for which our nature is made. And so he explains that the significance of the fairy story experience is rooted in the gospel, which is the paradigm of all of these experiences. Now, importantly, that relationship is reversed. He is not saying that the Gospels are like fairy tales. He is saying fairy tales affect us because our created natures are primed and designed to receive the gospel. So if we understand it in this way, then this aesthetic exaltation, he says, is not only that sudden glimpse of the truth behind the apparent fate of our world, but a glimpse that is actually a ray of light through the very chinks of the universe about us. These fairy stories are the lesser echoes of the greater thing. Now, we may be concerned with the historicity problem. Many people, we might broach this against Tolkien's argument in Mythopoeia. Look, if this is all about like aesthetic, experiential truth, does the empty tomb really matter in that case? If it gets us the proper sort of feeling, the proper sort of view, is one religion then truer than another? Tolkien's going to answer this in On Fairy Stories. He very firmly places the incarnation and the resurrection as the focal points of human history. This is the great eucatastrophe. This is the true consolation of all reality. Because Tolkien does seem to accept that desire and truth, they correspond to each other, at least sometimes. He writes about what the sages of Middle-earth think, the elven scholars. The desires of the soul may often be shown to be reasonable by arguments quite unconnected with personal wish. The fact that they accord with desire or even with personal wish does not invalidate them. Actually, the elves believed that the lightning of the heart, or the stirring of joy to which they often refer, which may accompany the hearing of a proposition or an argument, is not an indication of its falsity, but the recognition by the soul that it is on the path of truth. He tells us in the real world of a sudden clarity, he says, he had while riding his bicycle, something that reminded him of a dream experience. He says, I remember saying aloud and with absolute conviction, but of course that's how things really do work. And here meaning that reality corresponds to the story in the Gospels. He says that while the experience was the same thing, felt the same way as being rationally convinced of something, that he could not produce any sort of argument or any sort of chain of reasoning to explain that conviction. Instead, he hypothesizes he might have gotten a glimpse past our temporal existence and its necessity then for the sort of before and after into what he calls a direct appreciation, or what I might call an angelic form of knowing, right? Direct and immediate. What's happening here? The imagination as a faculty is at a jump. It's constructing something that hangs together as a piece. The rational faculty is not negated. It just has to catch up. Okay. That's the sort of the way that John Henry Newman says it happens. And Newman would have been very influential to Tolkien. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you should read Holly Ordway's book. Importantly, the imaginative or the intuitive grasp, it is not non-rational. It is non-rational. It is not irrational, which is different, right? Those are two different things. We could still formulate it logically if we wanted to. But notice, this is a theological commitment. This is the presupposition to Tolkien's apologetic, if you will. Tolkien, as a result of his theology, he believes that this is the way human beings operate, that this is the way that they're persuaded. It is a faith commitment that their heads follow their hearts. And as a result, then, knowing that this is the way human beings operate, the apologist or the author or whomever can then just use this situation to their advantage, can lean into it. So let's do a case study. I said that Tolkien was awake at the wheel in what he's writing. Let's see how he uses this method to sort of apply that unbelieving imagination into accepting a truth that most of them would probably regard as nonsense. And we're obviously going to talk about angels. Surprisingly, when I did my graduate seminar on this last semester, I looked into this. Around 2/3 of Americans believe in angels. And yet, probably 90% of us are pretty embarrassed to talk about them. And why is that? Right? Even if it is the case that 2/3 of us believe in angels, the cultural narrative surrounding angels hasn't yet shifted away from the old form of angels as this source of amusement to a source of like serious contemplation, whether it's artistic contemplation, theological contemplation. Why? I would guess that it's because our imaginations haven't yet been corrected. Our default assumption about angels still relies a lot more on Renaissance art or on comic strip jokes than on scripture, right? So right now, as I talk about angels in this room, what images are coming into your head? I'll give you a second. Okay. Is it this guy? Yeah. Okay. All right. Maybe if you've been in on certain internet trends, maybe it's something like this. Huh? Is this a biblically accurate angel? Sometimes. It is in Ezekiel. Of course, by the way, far more often the Bible just calls angels men or young men than describing these things. So this is a puto. That's what the Italians called them. It's very small, very silly, hardly worth thinking seriously about. What do you see when you see this image? You see a symptom of the gullibility of Christians. You may as well believe in Bigfoot, right? What sort of a God does this angel go along with? This kind of guy? He's most likely a very well-intentioned old man, lives in the clouds, something like Santa Claus. Primary adjectives, something like cute or sweet, maybe, whimsical. If you're a serious person with serious intellectual endeavors, if you're someone who is aware of the pressing concerns of contemporary life, is there really a place for a character like this in your cosmos? Okay, maybe if you're lucky, you can replace that with the mature female in the flowing robe. She's invisibly ministering to some poor soul in need. And this is just emotionalism. It's just dripping off of the canvas. And doesn't that just play right into the assumption that Christianity is a sop for sods, right? You need this crutch in order to cope with the world, right? We've got a lot of people with porcelain figures like this, and you're gonna give it to your grandchild. You're gonna pinch their cheeks, and you're gonna tell them that your angel's looking out for you. Maybe some people in this room don't get complacent, biblically accurate angel folks. I'm coming for you. Okay, look at these images. What sort of God goes along with something like this? Do we even know? Isn't there kind of like a low-lying undercurrent of horror here? The hidden God. Did he who make the lamb make thee? What place does this sort of angel have in your world, in your life, right? Your angel is looking out for you, but is it this kind of angel? Is their role any better, any clearer than the little chubby kid? Look, these depictions of angels are great for reminding us that the spiritual realm is like something serious and powerful, but they have their downsides too. In general, even those of us in the majority who believe in angels, we're probably going to struggle to locate them either in the scientific worldview or in our everyday world. Our instinct is we almost kind of have to bite the bullet in order to talk about it. There's these holdovers from this pre-scientific age. We've got to apologize for them. If you're a Protestant, by the way, and one that comes after Karl Barth, you might even kind of wonder whether giving any sort of role to angels is taking away from the priority of Christ. That's a different talk. Because this is, after all, kind of the way that angels are portrayed in the media. They're very nice people on the whole, as long as the boss is not around. The TV shows, et cetera, that feature angels specifically do not feature a very active or a very biblical God. Certainly not Jesus. But Tolkien's arrangement is very different. Some of you are going to know about this already. Some of you might not. So in danger of going over time, I'm going to give you a brief overview of Tolkien's angelology. The Ainur in Middle-earth, meaning the holy ones, are the most general, it's the most generic category. God creates them from his thought at the beginning of time. The music of the Ainur, the creation myth, they all participate in the performance of God's design, of his creation. Some of them become so enraptured, they want to enter into the beauty of what God has given existence, as if we kind of might want to enter into Tolkien's stories. So there's this countless number of them. Some of them stay up in heaven with Eru, with God, and some of them come down to rule over the world. And these are called the Valar, the powers or authorities. They are the chief angels. They're equivalent to the divine council, those of you that know a little bit about biblical theology. And Tolkien has this whole plot where they have the most power at the beginning of history because they're shaping it, they're preparing it for the habitation of humans, and then the eventual incarnation of God himself, because God is going to come and inhabit the universe too. And this is then his explanation for all of the myths and the legends, right? You've got all of the great supernatural entities way back then, not so much nowadays. Why? Because human beings have begun to grow up. And each of them has this sort of delegated space in the universe that they oversee. So Ulmo is the Vala of water, for instance. They have their servants called Maiar. These are lesser spirits. These are going to kind of correspond to the minor nature spirits of other mythologies. The wizards are in this category, for instance. And this is the way that Tolkien kind of has a Christian version of the Olympian gods. This is the way of him having like dryads and naiads and all of these other creatures. Sauron, by the way, is a Maiar. There are evil versions of these spirits because one of the Valar decides he wants to take ownership of the whole thing for himself, and he rebels, and he is the Satan figure. And then he and his angels, they make war against the good and righteous angels. And that is Tolkien's explanation for all of the cataclysms in the early world, where all the lava and the poison gas and the giant monsters. This is the war with the evil spirits. The Valar, the Maiar, they interact with mortals in varying ways. Sometimes they send dreams or these messages. Sometimes they show up in temporary bodies that they compose from existing matter, much like the church fathers and the scholastics are going to envision biblical angels doing. They're spiritual beings, so their interactions with us are going to be accommodated to our mode of understanding. So they're going to kind of look like us most times. But while they're present, while they oversee things, we're not tripping over them. Their role is not to rule it. It's to govern the world for us. Human beings are the inheritors of the cosmos. They are the goals of God's plan. The angels are there to enable us to do this. So they serve God for us, not us for them. Okay, blah, blah, blah. We're almost out of time. So what does this have to do with biblical angelology? Quite a lot, actually. Tolkien is very abundantly clear. Middle Earth is a monotheistic universe. His depiction of Eru is a fictionalized version of Yahweh. And that is, by the way, why he does not include more specific religion in his texts, because Yahweh has not specially revealed himself and entered into covenant with Abraham yet. And he has not set up the proper form of worship or instituted a church or anything like that, because it's like in ancient history. Does that make sense? So what Tolkien ends up accomplishing, not entirely deliberately, is actually exactly in line with a lot of what the most recent biblical theological research has to say about the role of angels in Scripture. So how does the Bible encourage us to think about angels? Many passages tell us that God, the King, has a court. He has an assembly of powerful beings. They're called the divine counselor, the B'nai Elohim. They can even be called gods themselves. This is Psalm 82. Jesus quotes this psalm. The angelic court, including Satan, apparently, is standing before God at the beginning of time, singing a song. Oh, is Silmarillion in here? 1 Kings 22, 19 through 23. We have an angel, a spirit which is commissioned to guide mortals into carrying out God's plan. Ephesians 6:12. Everywhere else, Paul tells us about the powers and the authorities, which happen to be the exact names that Tolkien uses in his system. He says that we are in a war in the midst of them. We know that there are at least, is there an angelic hierarchy? Yes, thank you, Pseudo-Dionysus. There are at least 4 different angelic roles. We've got the seraphim, the cherubim, angels, archangels. Obviously, some folks are going to add more. We've got an angel standing in the sun in Revelation, the wheels within wheels in Ezekiel. Sometimes you mistake them for regular human beings, right? Look at the ending of Mark. Look at Hebrews. Some of you have entertained angels and you haven't known it. They just kind of show up. But what else do we know? We know that angels minister for us, that they are powerful, yeah, but they will be judged by humans at the end of time. God's dealings with humanity are things into which angels long to look. We are the centerpiece of the universe, not them, but they do exercise power on our behalf. Now, in general, this picture set within its ancient Near Eastern context is actually a lot more similar to those among other pantheons, other religions, not just ancient Near East, but elsewhere. Classical period, Germanic, Norse. The central crucial difference is this. We're not polytheists, we are monotheists. There is a divine council. In other religions, there are multiple gods, they are all of the same type, and the leader is just the strongest one. Zeus is in charge because he is the biggest, but he is the same sort of being as all the rest. In this comprehension, there are multiple beings, they have different types. There is only one God, and then there are other created beings with delegated authority. So the angels might be called lowercase g gods, as in Psalm 82, but God is not one among many. He is the one above all, and that is what Tolkien calls him. Okay, so what? With that small step, this little adjustment actually bring things more in line with Hebrew and New Testament conceptions of angels, which is rooted in Tolkien's appreciation of the mythologies of other cultures. He is recovering this biblical situation. He's simultaneously placing angels in this different imaginative register. We all find Percy Jackson interesting, right? That's why paganism's back on the rise. So rather than stripping away these finite beings of the supernatural power, replacing them with these inaccurate winged women or chubby little babies, Tolkien is going to reframe angels as the better sanctified fulfillment of that natural human attraction. You can have everything that's good in Thor and Odin and Poseidon, but you can have it which is purified and harmonious with monotheism. You can also recover a very important aspect of Christian theology at the same time. So what then has Tolkien done for us with his own angelic hosts? He's done 3 things. We're going to wrap up. First, it's cool. Right? That's not a joke. Like, Tolkien makes us wish that there was a system like this, where we have these grand beings and they're watching over things, they're filling out the upper levels of the universe. Wouldn't we want a guardian angel if his name was Gandalf? So we have half the battle already won right there. Tolkien has taken us from thinking that the biblical picture of the divine council is weird and antiquated to thinking, man, I wish that were true. That's because his narratives show us what it would actually feel like to live in such a world. He's effectively rewritten our desires. Secondly, it actually presents an accurate picture of something that most people misunderstand. Right? We said, according to Ordway and others, one of the roles of imaginative apologetics is to clothe these unfamiliar terms with meaning. Most people do not have a correct understanding of what Christianity teaches about the nature of angels, or even the nature of Jesus or the cross, or any of it, okay? If we can fit the right content to the term, then we have accomplished something towards getting them to be able to evaluate the term as true. And third, in his attempt to sanctify these other mythologies that he loves under the rulership of Christ, he's recognizing what's true or almost true in these other religions, and that decreases the barrier to acceptance to Christianity for a lot of people. Why? Because the Christian picture becomes much more clearly something like a universal impulse. Look, all cultures at all times have had something like a ruling God and then these lesser attendants. But the philosophers, the higher religions, they very clearly teach that there can be only one supreme true God. And so this is a way that you can actually give credence to both of those claims. There is one supreme true God. There is also a council of created beings that oversee a lot of creation. So that increases plausibility. That's the widest explanatory scope possible for human experience, right? Christianity answers all the questions. So in short, Tolkien has done for angels what C.S. Lewis did with Aslan in Narnia. You want to read more? I've got a whole chapter on it in my book. But let's just review very briefly the journey that we've taken in this talk. First, we said Tolkien's both aware of and interested in regular apologetics. In fact, some of his best work is dealing with the imagination's movement from this image-making faculty to a meaning of subcreation, to a tool for responding to human desires. We read through some of Tolkien's own assertions about the role of the imagination in leading human beings to God. And then we very, very briefly looked at the angels. We could have picked anything else. We could have talked about friendship. We could have talked about virtue. We could have talked about a Christian attitude towards war. We could have talked about technology. The list goes on, okay? The downside to imaginative apologetics like this is that it can't be reduced into propositions, and I can't just stand up here and lecture to you about it. You actually have to go and read the story, because that's how it works. But the upside to sitting and reading a story with somebody is that it is much more engaging. It's much more accessible. It's holistic. The truth settles in more deeply than it does when you hear the Kalam cosmological argument or whatever. Not to say those are bad. I am not here advocating for imaginative apologetics over against those other forms of engagement. We still need things like the 5 ways, right? But I do want to advocate for seeing Tolkien as an apologist of this sort, as someone who persuades us of profound truth in this sort of a way. And what if we could help people hear it? Could we imagine that? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Freeman. All right, so we are going to open for questions in just a moment, but I think it's appropriate that we take a second to really receive this immensely rich content that we've encountered this evening, and allow that reception to formulate some of our responses and questions. So we'll just take a moment of reflection. So we'll now invite questions or reactions from both our in-person attendees and those joining us online. We have a microphone available here for our in-person audience. Simply raise your hand and I'll come over to you. Those online, you can submit questions through the online Zoom chat, and Emmett, our technician, will shoot me a text with your question, and we can address them that way. We only ask that due to the sensitivity in our culture and society, we really try to maintain an environment of thoughtful, respectful, and topic-centered dialogue. So any responses or questions, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Freeman. I found your presentation quite enlightening, particularly in reflecting on the beginning part. I've spent a lot of years in secular academia, and everything that's scientific is where everybody's looking. I really appreciate the fact that you could incorporate imagination into the scientific area. Scientists come up with ideas from their imagination. And the way that you brought together the fact that imagination and ideas can present out truths and understandings that we don't typically think of. It seems that when most people think, at least my reflection is that when most people think of imagination, they think of, oh, you're just making that up. You're just coming out of nowhere with it. But if you look at imagination as coming from inspiration because you have an image of God in your soul, and incorporate that into a worldview is very enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you. I went to hear Richard Dawkins' lecture a few weeks ago. He was at Texas A&M. And I mean, he said some interesting things in the last few years. So I was interested to see how his views would have changed, and they hadn't. But he was giving a lecture on why Charles Darwin was the greatest scientist that ever lived. It's not surprising. And so everything that he was saying about Darwin was great, and everything that he was saying about the design that you can see in nature, and he used that word, was great, and it made me really inspired. And then he started talking about the Bible, and all of the imagination and the creativity that he approaches in solving scientific problems, or that Darwin would have had to use in order to fit complex data together into a simple picture, it just goes out the window. And he reads the Bible in the most wooden, like childish way possible. And it is a lack of imagination on his part. The fact that the Bible is a piece of literature. It's not just a piece of literature, but it is not less than a piece of literature. And I wish that more people would recognize the wider scope of imagination that you're talking about, especially in the sciences, because that's how all great scientific work is achieved. And God designed that too.
Thank you. Others?
Thank you. One of the things you said that most stood out for me is how Tolkien effectively rewrote our desires. And you gave the great example of angelology. What's another sector within Christianity that you think his stories or his letters are really apt to rearrange? I think there's probably a lot, but
there is a lot. I will say it's the thing that got me into Tolkien studies in the first place. So I was at the University of Edinburgh. I was finishing up a thesis on Augustine's doctrine of original sin. And I wrote on it because it confused me, right? And so I wanted to get sense in my own mind. And so I'm coming out of that, and I start reading some of Tolkien's stuff about the nature of evil, the ring wraiths, Gollum, Shelob. I was like, wow, this is Augustine, right? This is evil as absence. This is like fairly sophisticated patristic and medieval theology here. But he's packaging it in a thing that you could hand to a 4-year-old and say, do you get this? Yeah, that's scary. I don't want that. And what's fascinating about Tolkien is he presents these incredibly striking images of evil, but they are not fascinating. That's the problem with a lot of other modern literature and cinema is you get the kids with the Darth Vader lunchbox. You don't think Luke Skywalker is as cool as Darth Vader or the stormtroopers. And that's really weird, by the way. This is not a talk on Star Wars, but like Darth Vader is a genocidal dictator, and the stormtroopers are based on Nazis. And like you're selling elementary school kids these products. It's weird. But so like who in the Lord of the Rings do you want to be like? Do you want to be like Sauron? No. You want to be like Aragorn. All of a sudden, all of the good guys are way more interesting than the bad guys. They are the cool ones. So that model of virtue is really interesting because our society, at least in the United States, does not have a coherent picture of goodness anymore. That's why people prefer Batman to Superman. This is not to talk about Superman. What do people say? Superman is boring. Why? Because Superman is just the cipher for whatever like the best big brother in the world is. Superman is the good guy, capital G. If you don't know what that means, you're going to write a boring character. So we do Batman because everybody knows what it means to be brooding and angry. So coming out of World War I, coming out of losing his dad and his mom, like Tolkien has a very sophisticated psychology of sin and a very realistic psychology of virtue. And I think that's the next thing that needs to be recaptured.
Thank you. We have a question from one of our online attendees. She writes, from a non-theologian and a life member of the Mythopoetic Society, would you share some thoughts about the in-universe themes of slow sadness and decay?
Okay.
Noting it's almost Nordic, she says.
It is Nordic. It's not almost Nordic. He's doing it deliberately. But interestingly, as I said to somebody earlier today, I forget who it was, the difference between tragedy and comedy in the classical sense is basically just where the story stops. Right? You have the decline at the worst point. If the story ends there, then it's a tragedy. But the worst point is also where the eucatastrophe happens. You just keep telling the story, the world becomes a comedy in the end. That's why Dante writes what he writes. So what Tolkien sees in Norse mythology is what is real, which is that it is better to be on the side of goodness, even if it's losing, than to be on the side of evil when it wins. Because in Norse mythology, the gods die. Right? The giants win in the end. That's what Ragnarok is. All of the gods get killed. But the human beings are still going to choose to fight on the side of the gods. And so Tolkien finds that very powerful. And we do live in a fallen world. The world, it's already and not yet. There's still a lot of evil and wickedness that needs to be overcome. And you're going to have victory in the end. You're going to, reach heaven. You're going to be glorified. But that doesn't mean you're not going to die. So for him, the Norse vision of the universe of I'm going to go down fighting on the side of goodness is a lot more consonant with Christianity saying, yeah, you might. Because that's what Jesus did. Right? There is a resurrection on the end. That's what the Norse didn't know and the Christians do. And that's how he transforms. He doesn't just leave it there with the godlessness and the sadness. I mean, the elves are leaving Middle Earth. Tolkien in one of his letters calls it fighting the long defeat. I'm sure some of you have heard that term. I mean, the world on its own is suffering a long defeat apart from Christ. But the way that Christ achieves victory in the world is not the way that many people are expecting it to look. Hopefully that answers the question. That theme of sadness can mislead a lot of people into thinking that Tolkien is anti-Christian. He's not anti-Christian. He's just very conscious of the doctrine of the fall. And if you know where to look, you also see his doctrine of eucatastrophe and redemption. You just have to be able to hold both of them together.
Thank you. Others?
A bit of a fire hose, I am aware. I'm sorry.
All right. Well, join me in thanking again Dr. Freeman for his time and contributions this evening. Thank you, Doctor. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening for this first lecture in honor of J.R.R. Tolkien. This is something new that we're trying in the Department of Continuing Education and here at Oblate School of Theology. If you haven't come to campus before, I would really, really hope to make clear how welcome all those who have been longtime members of our community and come back, but also new folks who are hopefully getting a little bit of nourishment and value in what we're bringing to our community. It's part of the Oblate mission to educate, form, and renew men and women to preach the gospel to the most abandoned. And I would note that it's men and women, right? It's not necessarily regular churchgoers. It's not necessarily just Christians. It's not necessarily anyone but who you are when you come to this campus and be among our community. So I'd like to reiterate that welcome. I'm going to conclude with some notes of appreciation. First of all, I've described her numerous times this week as a woman who moves the world, and that remains true. So please give a round of applause to our program coordinator, Veronica Montalvo, who has done so much for our department. We also have Emmett, and backed up by his lovely wife, Michelle, who joins us this evening. So Emmett, our technical person for tonight, thank you. And lastly, I want to make a special note of two local businesses that were going to be with us tonight, but unfortunately they ran into some last minute staffing issues that prevented that. But Night's Watch and The Sanctuary are two incredible local businesses that sell anything you would need to go to the Renaissance Fair. They sell stuff for Dungeons and Dragons. They sell all kinds of incredible materials that are just up our alley. So please give them your appreciation in business if and when you can. They're right up Blanco for a little ways, not too far from here. And lastly, again, thank you so much for coming out to this first lecture in honor of J.R.R. Tolkien. Safe travels home. Thank you.